The first time the soldiers knocked, Noah Carter thought they had the wrong door. The second time, the whole metal frame shuddered hard enough to rattle the cracked coffee mug on his sink, and he knew they hadn't come for a neighbor. Rain tapped against the narrow window over his bed in a thin, steady hiss, threading through the hum of broken neon outside and the far-off groan of cargo haulers crawling through Dockside District. The room smelled like wet concrete, old radiator dust, and the faint, stubborn trace of bread crust on his fingers. Noah pushed himself upright too fast and the world tilted for a second, his stomach tightening with that hollow, scraping ache that came from going too long on too little. He had meant to save half the loaf for morning. He had meant to be smarter than that. Another knock came, deeper now, the kind that carried authority even through cheap steel. Resident of Unit 6B, a voice called from the hallway, clipped and mechanical through a helmet speaker. Open the door. Noah swung his legs over the side of the mattress and sat there in the dark for half a heartbeat, staring at the stain on the floor where the roof leaked whenever the weather turned. His work boots were still on. He must have fallen asleep without meaning to, one arm over his eyes, his jacket still damp from the walk home. He could feel the small shape of the coin in his pocket even before his hand touched it, smooth-edged and cool through the fabric, like it had been waiting for him to remember it. Outside, thunder rolled low over the harbor. Somewhere downstairs, a baby started crying and then stopped all at once. Unit 6B, the voice repeated. Open the door immediately. Noah stood, every joint protesting after 14 hours unloading freight containers for a company that still paid in paper vouchers half the time. He crossed the room barefoot, passing the hot plate that hadn't worked in 2 weeks, the single chair with one short leg, the tiny counter where a paper sack lay folded open and empty. That sack had held the last thing he owned worth calling dinner. He could still see the bakery grease darkening the paper, could still feel the weight of the loaf in his hand from earlier that evening, warm for all of 5 minutes before the harbor wind stole the heat from it. He stopped 2 feet from the door and listened. There were at least 3 people outside, maybe more. Heavy boots. Armor by the sound of it. Not local police, then. Dockside cops banged doors like men who were tired and underpaid. These knocks had precision. These knocks expected obedience. Noah swallowed and tasted salt and stale air. His hand drifted to the chain lock, then hesitated. Hours earlier, on Mercer Alley, under the busted blue light of a fish market sign, he had seen a little alien girl sitting barefoot in the rain with her knees pulled to her chest and her eyes too proud for someone that hungry. He had told himself to keep walking. He had made it almost 10 feet before the sound of her stomach stopping him colder than the weather ever could. Now soldiers were outside his door in the middle of the night, and Noah had the sinking feeling that whatever he had given away with that last loaf had been much bigger than bread. Mercer Alley always smelled different after sunset. In the daytime it was fish brine, diesel exhaust, and hot metal from the loading cranes down at the harbor. At night, when the market shutters rolled down and the crowds thinned out, the air turned colder and meaner, full of rainwater, ozone from flickering signs, and the sour breath of trash compactors working somewhere behind the old transit wall. Noah kept his head down and his shoulders hunched against the weather as he cut through the alley with a paper sack tucked under one arm, guarding it more carefully than anything else he owned. The bakery on 9th had sold him the day-old loaf for 3 crumpled vouchers and a promise he would settle the rest next week. It was not much, just a rough brown loaf with a split crust and one corner gone hard, but in Dockside District that counted as luck. His stomach had been tightening on itself since noon, and every few steps the smell rose warm and earthy through the bag, making his mouth water in a way that felt almost embarrassing. He had already planned it out. Half tonight. Half in the morning before the early shift. He might even make it last until lunch if he drank enough water with it. Then he heard the sound. It was not loud. Not a cry. More like someone trying very hard not to make one. Noah slowed near a dead vending kiosk washed in blue light from a sign overhead that buzzed so badly it made the whole puddled street seem to tremble. At first he saw only a heap of silver fabric tucked between 2 cargo pallets. Then the heap moved. A small figure sat there with her knees pulled tight beneath a torn ceremonial wrap, bare feet on the wet concrete, shoulders shaking in short little tremors she was trying to hide. Her skin caught the bad neon in shifting shades of blue-green, like sea glass held under storm light. She could not have been older than 8 or 9 by human standards. A child, whatever world had named her. Noah stopped. The girl looked up so fast it almost startled him. Her eyes were large, luminous, and sharp with the kind of fear that had learned to wear pride like armor. Dirt streaked one cheek. Rain had flattened a few pale strands of hair against her forehead. She looked at the paper bag in his arm first, then at his face, and then away again, as if hating herself for either one. Noah glanced back toward the mouth of the alley. People still moved along the far street, blurred shapes under umbrellas and cargo hoods, none of them paying attention. A tram bell rang somewhere 2 blocks over. He should have kept walking. Any decent instinct for self-preservation would have told him that. Alien miners did not end up alone in dockside by accident, especially not dressed in cloth that fine, even torn and soaked through. Trouble clung to situations like this. Legal trouble, expensive trouble, the kind that landed on people who could not afford rent, let alone a lawyer. Noah tightened his grip on the bag and took 2 steps past her. Then, in the thin silence between one passing truck and the next, he heard it. A small, involuntary sound from her stomach, hollow and fragile and so painfully human that it stopped him cold. Noah shut his eyes for a second. When he turned back, the girl had gone still again, chin raised now, as if she would rather freeze than beg. He crouched a few feet away so he would not tower over her. Up close he could see the fine silver stitching at the edge of her wrap and a narrow bracelet on her wrist engraved with symbols too clean and deliberate to belong in an alley like this. She watched him like a cornered animal. Noah reached into the paper bag, tore off the heel of the loaf, and held it out. Her gaze flicked from the bread to his face with open suspicion. "It is not poisoned," he said quietly. The words felt ridiculous the moment they left his mouth, but something in her expression shifted, just barely. Rain ticked off the metal pallets beside them. Somewhere above, a faulty sign sparked and hissed. Still she did not move. Noah looked at the bread in his own hand, then at the child trying not to shake, and with a tired breath that felt like surrender more than generosity, he opened the bag and held out the whole loaf instead. For a moment the girl did not move at all. The rain kept falling in fine silver threads around them, ticking against broken plastic, running in narrow streams along the cracked concrete, but she stayed perfectly still, staring at the loaf in Noah's hand as if it were some kind of trick she had not yet figured out. Up close, he could see how tired she really was. Not the ordinary kind of tired that came from a long day or a missed meal, but the deep, shaky exhaustion of someone who had been afraid for too long and had run out of ways to hide it. Her fingers were small and blue-green and trembling where they gripped the edge of her wrap. A thin metal band circled one wrist, too polished for dockside, engraved with tiny geometric marks that caught the neon in brief cold flashes. Noah kept his arm out, steady, and waited. "Take it," he said. "Before I change my mind." He meant it as a joke, the sort of dry little thing people said when they wanted to make kindness feel less serious than it was, but she did not smile. Her eyes narrowed instead, studying him with a caution that looked far too old for her face. Then, slowly, she reached forward and took the loaf with both hands. She did it carefully, as though it might be taken back if she moved too fast. The warmth had already gone out of the crust, but when she pulled it close, something in her expression softened anyway. Relief, maybe. Or disbelief. She tore off a small piece first, not because she was delicate about it, Noah realized, but because she was trying to prove to herself it was real. The bite disappeared almost at once. Then she ate another, and another, faster now, though even hungry she made an effort to stay neat, as if good manners had been drilled into her somewhere far from alleys and leaking pipes. Noah looked away to give her some dignity and found himself watching the rain collect in an oil slick at the gutter, the colors shifting purple and green beneath the market lights. "What is your name?" the girl asked after a few seconds. Her voice was soft and musical in a way that made the words sound almost too precise, each syllable carefully placed. Noah blinked and glanced back at her. "Noah." She nodded as if filing that away somewhere important. "I am Miri." The name fit her somehow, small and bright. "Well, Miri," he said, leaning one shoulder against the dead vending machine, "you should probably be somewhere warmer than this." She lowered her eyes to the loaf. "I was," she said. It was such a quiet answer that Noah almost missed the weight inside it. He noticed then that one side of her ceremonial wrap had come loose near the shoulder, exposing a layer of finer fabric beneath and a stitched crest worked in silver thread. Not a decoration. A symbol. Formal. Expensive. Wrong for the district and very wrong for a child alone at night. Noah felt a knot form low in his stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. "Are you lost?" he asked. Miri looked up at him sharply. Rain beaded on her lashes, making her eyes seem brighter. "No," she said, too quickly. Then, after a pause, "I was separated." Noah let that sit between them for a moment. Separated could mean 100 things in Dockside. A crowd. A panic. A choice. He glanced toward the main street again and noticed movement beyond the alley mouth, more organized than the usual evening traffic. 2 patrol drones drifted past above the road, their white search lamps combing over awnings and transit signs. One of the public screens mounted on the corner building blinked from an ad for fuel cells to an emergency banner in 3 languages. Noah could not make out the words from here, but the tone of the chime that accompanied it was enough to tighten every muscle in his back. Miri heard it too. Her head turned instantly toward the street, and all the softness that had entered her face vanished. Fear came back hard and clean. "Do not tell them you saw me," she whispered. Before Noah could answer, she fumbled beneath the loose edge of her wrap and pulled free a small object on a fine chain. It was a coin or medallion, no bigger than a silver dollar, made of some pale metal that seemed to hold light even under the broken neon. At its center was a 3-pointed star inside a ring of tiny etched marks. She pressed it into his palm and folded his fingers over it with surprising firmness for such a small hand. Her skin was ice cold. "If they ask," she said, her voice shaking now despite the effort she made to control it, "say that I was not afraid with you." Then she stepped back, clutching the loaf against her chest, and slipped out of the alley so quickly that by the time Noah reached the corner she was already gone, leaving only rain, blue light, and the strange weight of polished metal cooling in his hand while the emergency chime echoed over Dockside like a warning. Noah stood at the mouth of Mercer Alley long after Miri disappeared into the rain, his hand still closed around the medallion so tightly that the ridged edges pressed a pattern into his skin. The public screen on the corner flickered again, washing the wet street in pale white light before resolving into a formal seal he did not recognize, a ring of stars around a vertical silver line. Then came the voice, smooth and official, too calm to be anything but serious. "Attention all residents of Dockside District. By order of the Interstellar Transit Authority and Allied Security Command, street access is now restricted pending the recovery of a protected minor. Please remain in your assigned residences and report any unusual contact immediately." Noah felt the cold settle deeper beneath his jacket. Protected minor. Not missing child. Not runaway. Protected. The kind of phrase people used when power wanted to sound polite while reminding everyone who held the weapons and the laws. Around him, the district reacted in small, nervous ways. Market shutters that had already been halfway down slammed the rest of the way closed. A vendor dragging crates toward a side door abandoned one in the rain and hurried inside. 2 men under the awning across the street stopped arguing long enough to look up at the screen, then at each other, then in every direction except their own consciences. Overhead, the patrol drones made another pass, slow and deliberate, their search lamps sweeping over puddles, rusted railings, and patched roofs with a sterile white glow that made everything look guilty. Noah slipped the medallion into the inner pocket of his jacket and started walking. He kept his pace even, not too fast, not too careful, boots splashing through runoff that smelled like fuel, salt, and old iron. The bread he had given away had left his stomach feeling oddly lighter and much emptier at the same time. Hunger sharpened the edges of everything now. The cold. The noise. The thought that he had handed his last meal to a little girl with a silver crest on her clothes and a warning in her eyes. He cut through the service lane behind Harker's storage and took the stairs up to the residence blocks, counting each landing without meaning to. On the third floor he nearly ran into Mrs. Bell, who had opened her door just wide enough to watch the hallway with one suspicious gray eye. "You hear that alert?" she whispered before he could say anything. "They said the whole district is on hold. Must be some diplomat's kid." Noah gave a tired shrug and kept moving. "Dockside gets stranger every week." Mrs. Bell sniffed like that was not enough information, but she let him pass. At the next turn he found Rourke leaning against the corridor vending unit with his thumbs hooked in his suspenders, chewing something that smelled strongly of synthetic mint. Rourke lived 2 doors down from Noah and knew everyone else's business better than his own. His narrow face lit with curiosity the second he spotted the damp paper bag tucked empty under Noah's arm. "You look like hell," Rourke said. "Rough shift, or did somebody beat you to dinner?" Noah stopped at his door and dug for his key. "Just work." Rourke's eyes dropped briefly to Noah's jacket pocket, where the faint outline of the medallion must have shown for an instant beneath the wet fabric. "What is that?" he asked. Noah slid the door key into place too quickly. "Nothing." It was the wrong answer. He knew it as soon as the word left him. Rourke smiled in that thin way some men did when they smelled leverage. "Funny night for nothing." Noah pushed his door open and stepped inside before the conversation could grow teeth. "Get some sleep, Rourke." He shut the door and turned the lock, then the chain, then stood with his back against the metal as the room settled around him in familiar poverty. Leaking ceiling. Rusted sink. The little radiator clicking without warmth. Outside, the emergency broadcast repeated from another street screen, softer now through rain and concrete. Noah pulled the medallion from his pocket and held it under the weak kitchen light. Up close, the star at its center seemed almost alive, lines so fine they shimmered when he tilted it. It was not cheap. It was not ordinary. And somewhere beyond the walls of his cheap apartment, an entire district had gone tense because a frightened little girl had pressed it into his hand and said she had not been afraid with him. Noah set the medallion on the counter, stared at it for a long moment, then looked toward the door as if he could already hear the future coming up the hallway in heavy boots. Noah did not bother turning on the overhead light. The bulb in the ceiling had been flickering for weeks, and tonight the weak lamp over the sink felt kinder somehow, leaving the corners of the room in shadow and the little silver medallion on the counter bright as a drop of moonlight. He peeled off his damp jacket, hung it over the back of the chair with the bad leg, and stood there for a moment listening to the building breathe around him. Pipes clicked in the walls. Somewhere upstairs, somebody dragged furniture across a floor. Out in the corridor, a door opened and closed, followed by the muffled rise of 2 voices talking too fast and too low. Dockside had a way of turning fear into whispers before it ever became action. Noah reached for the faucet, let the water run until it lost its rusty smell, and drank 2 cups. In a row just to quiet the ache in his stomach. It did not work. Hunger sat deeper than that now, a slow, twisting emptiness that seemed to sharpen the edges of the room. His eyes kept drifting back to the medallion. Under the yellow sink light, the 3-pointed star looked less like decoration and more like a seal, something official enough that carrying it might count as trouble in 3 different jurisdictions. He turned it over carefully. The back was engraved too, not with a name but with a pattern of tiny lines circling a central mark that resembled an eye or a compass rose. Noah did not know alien scripts, but he knew expensive workmanship when he saw it. Whatever Miri had handed him, it had not belonged in the pocket of a man who rationed bread by the slice. The emergency message sounded again from the public screen outside, the same soft chime followed by the same calm instructions telling residents to remain where they were and report unusual contact. This time another voice joined it, deeper and more formal, speaking in a language Noah did not understand. The sounds rolled like water over polished stone, beautiful and unsettling at once. He imagined Miri hearing that voice somewhere out in the district and either running toward it or away from it. He could not decide which possibility troubled him more. Noah opened the drawer beneath the sink, shoved aside a bent spoon, a rent receipt, and a box of matches with 3 left, then paused. Hiding the medallion there felt ridiculous. If anyone important came looking, they would find it in 10 seconds. He tried the loose vent cover by the bed instead, then the back of the medicine cabinet, then finally slid the medallion inside an old coffee tin on the top shelf above the sink, beneath a stack of folded pay stubs no thief would ever bother touching. It was the kind of hiding place a poor man trusted not because it was clever, but because poverty itself often went ignored. He had just stepped back down from the chair when a soft scrape sounded outside his door. Noah froze. The scrape came again, followed by the delicate rattle of somebody testing whether the handle was locked. Not pounding. Not official. Curious. He moved quietly toward the door and looked through the warped peephole. The hallway beyond was dim, one of the strip lights at the far end humming with a blue-white stutter. Rourke stood 2 doors down with his hands in his pockets, pretending to study the broken vending unit while his eyes kept sliding toward Noah's apartment. The man lingered another few seconds, then sauntered off toward the stairwell, casual in the way only guilty people ever were. Noah let out a slow breath and rested his forehead briefly against the cool metal of the door. So that was how this night was going to be. Not just soldiers and sealed streets, but neighbors sniffing for reward money. He chained the lock again, checked the window latch, and sat on the edge of the bed without removing his boots. The radiator coughed once and went silent. Rain ran down the glass in wavering silver lines, bending the lights of patrol drones into pale smears across the room. Noah rubbed both hands over his face and told himself that in a city this big, kindness had to be able to stay small. A loaf of bread. A frightened child. A few minutes in an alley. That should have been all it was. Then, from somewhere far below, an engine note rose through the wet night, deep and controlled, not like the battered delivery trucks of dockside but something heavier, cleaner, official. It idled for a few seconds, then cut out. A minute later the building's front buzzer sounded once, long and hard, and every quiet noise in the hallway seemed to disappear at once. The silence after the buzzer felt unnatural, like the whole building had inhaled and forgotten how to let the breath go. Noah stayed seated on the edge of the bed for 3 slow seconds, every muscle in his back pulled tight, eyes fixed on the door as if looking hard enough might tell him what waited beyond it. Then the sounds began. The front entry downstairs released with a metallic buzz. A draft moved through the old ventilation shaft, carrying up the smell of wet concrete and machine oil from the lobby. Heavy footsteps followed, measured and unhurried, too disciplined to belong to tenants and too many to belong to a single visitor. They reached the first landing and paused. A murmur of voices rose beneath them, low and controlled, one human, one not. Noah stood and crossed to the sink on instinct, not because he had any plan left, but because standing still suddenly felt impossible. The coffee tin waited on the top shelf exactly where he had shoved it, plain and dented and harmless looking, the kind of object nobody saw until they were looking for something to take. He touched it once just to reassure himself it was there, then pulled his hand back as another set of footsteps entered the stairwell below. There were more of them than he had thought. The strip light outside his door clicked and hummed, then steadied. Across the hall, Mrs. Bell's lock turned with painful care. Noah heard her door open an inch and imagined her peering into the corridor with that same one-eyed suspicion she wore for overdue packages and strangers. Somewhere farther down, another tenant hissed for someone to get back inside. No one wanted to be the person caught in the hall when authority arrived in dockside. Noah moved to the peephole again. The warped lens turned the corridor into a curved little world of dull paint and bad light, but it was enough. At the far end of the hall, two figures came into view first, tall and broad-shouldered in pale armor that reflected the fluorescent glare in cold lines. Their helmets covered the upper halves of their faces, leaving only the lower jaw and mouth visible, human enough to be unsettling and alien enough to remind anyone watching that Dockside's rules were not local tonight. Behind them walked a third figure in a dark coat with a data tablet glowing blue in one hand. Beside the stairwell, Rourke stood with his back straight and his hair hastily smoothed down, trying and failing to look helpful rather than eager. Noah felt something hard and tired settle in his chest. So that was it. Rourke had not even waited until morning. One of the armored officers said something too low for the peephole to carry. Rourke answered quickly and pointed down the hall. Not at random. Directly at Noah's door. The man even smiled afterward, thin and nervous, the smile of somebody already counting money that was not in his pocket yet. The officer with the tablet glanced toward Unit 6B, scanned whatever details sat on the glowing screen, and gave a short nod. The group started forward. Mrs. Bell's door snapped shut so fast the latch clicked. Like a gunshot in the quiet. Noah stepped back from the peephole and forced himself to breathe through his nose. His heart was working too hard, thudding against his ribs in hot, heavy beats that made the room feel smaller with each one. He looked once at the window, for stories up over a slick alley and a rusted fire ladder that had lost 2 rungs last winter. Not an option. He looked at the sink, the bed, the chair, the cracked mug, the kind of inventory a poor man could make in half a second because none of it took long to count. Then his gaze stopped on the coffee tin above the sink and on the folded pay stubs beneath it, and a strange thought flickered through him with the clarity of hunger. If they were here because of Miri, then the medallion mattered. If it mattered, then giving it up might do more than expose him. It might expose her fear, her trust, the one small thing she had chosen when she had nothing else. The footsteps stopped outside his door. For one suspended instant all Noah could hear was the ticking radiator and rain striking the window in soft, relentless taps. Then a gloved hand struck the metal hard enough to shake dust from the frame, and the voice from earlier, clipped and amplified, filled the room. Resident of Unit 6B. Open the door immediately. Noah stared at the door for one more heartbeat, then reached up and took the coffee tin from the shelf. The metal felt colder than it should have. He slid the medallion into his pocket instead, close against his shirt, as if cheap fabric and body heat could somehow make it less dangerous. Another knock landed, not louder this time, but firmer, the kind that said the people outside did not intend to leave without an answer. Noah crossed the room, unhooked the chain, turned the lock, and pulled the door open just far enough to fill the frame with himself. The corridor beyond seemed brighter than his apartment by comparison, washed in the hard white glare of hallway lights and the pale reflections off polished armor. 2 officers stood directly outside, tall and still, their chest plates marked with a symbol Noah did not know, a silver line crossed by 3 stars. Between them and a step back stood the figure in the dark coat, human, middle-aged, dry despite the weather, tablet in hand and expression set in the tired neutrality of someone paid to manage difficult nights. Farther down the hall, Rourke hovered near the stairwell trying not to look like he was waiting for applause. Noah Carter, the man with the tablet asked. Noah kept one hand on the door and nodded once. That depends who is asking. The man glanced up from the tablet, and for the first time there was the faintest flicker of something like surprise in his eyes, as if humor had not been on the list of things he expected to find in Unit 6B. Transit Liaison Markham, he said. Attached to Allied Security Command. We need to ask you a few questions regarding possible contact with a protected off-world miner. The words were formal, but the room seemed to hear what lay beneath them all the same. Across the hall, Mrs. Bell's door had opened again by half an inch. Noah could feel her attention like a draft. He could also feel Rourke's. That part stung more than he wanted to admit. At this hour? Noah asked. At this level of urgency, Markham replied. One of the armored officers shifted slightly, and Noah caught the clean, rain-cold smell of synthetic fabric and machine oil. Not threatening exactly. Just controlled. Everything about them was controlled. Noah looked past Markham down the corridor. You could have asked the whole building, he said. Looks like half of them are already listening. Markham followed his glance, noticed the cracked open doors, the shadows lingering where tenants pretended not to stare, and his mouth tightened. This conversation would be easier inside, Mr. Carter. Noah hesitated. It was a poor man's hesitation, the kind that counted what could be broken, what could be taken, what dignity could still be kept in one room with peeling paint and a bed too narrow for dreams. Then he stepped back. I do not have much furniture, he said. So try not to be disappointed. The line was dry enough that Markham almost smiled this time. The officers entered first, not barging, simply taking in the room in one sweeping glance that missed nothing. Markham followed, and the hallway behind them narrowed to a slice of curious faces until one officer reached back without looking and pulled the door shut. The latch clicked. The apartment shrank around the sound. Noah stood near the sink with the lamp at his shoulder, aware of every flaw in the place all at once, the patched wall, the leaking window, the empty bread sack crumpled on the counter. Markham's gaze landed on that sack, then on Noah's face. Mr. Carter, he said, voice quieter now, did you encounter a small alien girl in Dockside this evening? For a second Noah thought about denying everything. He thought about Rourke outside, about the medallion in his pocket, about the way Miri had clutched that loaf with both hands like warmth itself had become fragile. He thought about her voice when she had said, say that I was not afraid with you. So when he answered, the truth came out before caution could stop it. Yes, Noah said. I did. The room held still after Noah said it, as if even the radiator had stopped ticking to listen. Markham studied him for a long second, not with triumph, not even with suspicion exactly, but with the careful attention of a man trying to decide whether he had just found a problem or an answer. One of the armored officers turned his helmet slightly, a tiny mechanical shift accompanied by the soft whir of internal servos. Noah could hear the rain against the window again, thin and steady, and beneath it the faint electric hum of the hallway light outside. Hunger made everything feel sharper than it should have. The damp collar of his shirt against his neck. The cold medallion pressing lightly through the fabric over his chest. The empty paper sack on the counter, folded in on itself like proof. Start at the beginning, Markham said. His tone had changed. Less official now. More human. Noah leaned one hip against the sink because standing perfectly straight suddenly felt too much like performing innocence. There is not much beginning to it, he said. I was walking home from the docks through Mercer Alley. I saw a kid sitting in the rain. She looked cold and hungry. So I gave her my bread. One of the officers looked toward the counter again. At the crumpled sack. At the bare sink. Markham followed that glance, and something unreadable passed over his face. She identified herself, he asked. She told me her name was Miri. The effect of that name was immediate. Not dramatic. Worse. Controlled people becoming more careful. The officer nearest the door straightened almost imperceptibly. Markham lowered the tablet an inch. Did she say anything else? Noah hesitated. Not because he meant to lie, but because the memory came back with such strange clarity that for a moment he was no longer in his apartment at all. He was back under the broken blue market sign, watching a child hold a loaf of bread like it was the first kind thing the night had offered her. She said she had been separated, Noah answered. And she asked me not to tell anyone I had seen her. Markham exhaled very quietly through his nose. Did you? If I had, Noah said, letting his eyes drift toward the closed door where Rourke waited somewhere beyond it like a bad smell, you would not have had to come asking. For the first time, the corner of Markham's mouth twitched. Not amusement exactly. Recognition. The look of a man who had spent too long around fear and knew what courage looked like when it wore cheap clothes and did not call itself by that name. He tapped something on the tablet. Did the miner appear injured? He asked. No. Noah thought of Miri's shaking hands, the rain in her hair, the pride in her voice. Just exhausted. And scared. The second word lingered. One of the officers turned slightly toward Markham and spoke in a low stream of liquid consonants Noah did not understand. Markham answered in the same language, slower, with the awkward care of someone who had learned it for diplomacy rather than childhood. Then he looked back at Noah. "Mr. Carter," he said, "did she leave anything with you?" There it was. Clean and simple. The question Noah had been waiting for since the first knock. Noah felt the medallion against his chest like a second heartbeat. He could lie. He could say no. He could hand it over and be done with all of this. But Miri had not given it to him like property. She had given it to him like trust. That difference mattered more than he could explain, even to himself. Noah met Markham's eyes and chose the narrow middle path that poor men learned early, the one between surrender and foolishness. "Why does it matter?" he asked. Markham did not answer right away. The room seemed to tighten around the silence. Then, from somewhere just outside the apartment, beyond the shut door and the listening hallway and the thin walls of dockside, a child's voice rose clear and unmistakable. "He is the one." Noah's head snapped toward the sound before his mind could catch up, and every person in the room turned at once. Markham reached the door first, not in a rush, but with the quick certainty of someone who had just been handed the one piece that made the rest of the night make sense. He opened it, and the hallway light spilled into the apartment in a clean white sheet, brighter than the lamp over Noah's sink and cold enough to make the room look even smaller than it already was. For half a second Noah saw only boots and polished floor and the narrow line of curious faces retreating behind half-closed doors. Then Miri stepped into view. She looked nothing like the child from Mercer Alley and exactly like her at the same time. Someone had wrapped her now in a dark blue cloak with silver fastening pins at the shoulders, the fabric dry and heavy and fine enough that it seemed to drink the hallway light instead of reflecting it. Her hair had been combed back from her face, though one pale strand had escaped and curved over her brow. The dirt was gone from her cheek. The fear was not. It sat deeper now, quieter, hidden under the careful stillness of a child who had been taught how important people stand when others are watching. But her eyes were the same. Bright. Watchful. Young in all the ways that mattered. She looked past Markham, past the armored officers, and found Noah at once. "He is the one," she said again, softer this time, as if she did not need the whole hall to hear it anymore. "He gave me the bread." Noah felt the room shift around those words. Not dramatically. Not with relief, exactly. More like a set of locked gears had finally fallen into alignment. The officer nearest the doorway straightened and lowered his chin in a formal motion toward Miri. Another stepped aside at once, making more space for her without being asked. Even Markham's shoulders eased a fraction. Across the hall, Mrs. Bell's door opened another inch. Noah did not need to look to know Rourke. Was still somewhere near the stairwell, listening hard enough to swallow his own breathing. Miri took 2 small steps into the apartment and stopped just inside the threshold, hands folded around each other beneath the cloak. The posture was elegant. The fingers were still nervous. Noah noticed then that the hem of the cloak did not quite hide her feet, and despite everything that had changed in the last few minutes, she was still wearing the same thin shoes unsuited for rain and cold. Something about that detail hit him harder than the armor, the official voices, or the fact that his cheap apartment now contained more authority than he had seen in his whole life. Children could be dressed in ceremony in a hurry. They could not be comforted as quickly. "You should not be out in the hallway," one of the armored officers said to her in that flowing language Noah did not understand. Miri did not look at him. She kept her gaze on Noah as if the rest of the room were only weather. "I wanted to tell him myself," she said, this time in English, careful and clear. So that he would know he did nothing wrong. Noah had not realized until that instant how tightly he had been holding himself together. The words loosened something inside him, not enough to feel safe, but enough to feel the shape of the night differently. He glanced at Markham. "That is good to hear," he said dryly. "Because your friend by the stairs seems to have bet against me." Miri frowned slightly, not understanding, but Markham did, and there was no mistaking the brief flick of irritation across his face. Before anyone could answer, movement came from farther down the hall, subtle but immediate in its effect. The two officers at the doorway stepped straighter. Markham turned. Even Miri's small hands tightened once beneath the cloak before smoothing flat again. A new figure approached with unhurried steps, and the air in the corridor seemed to change around her, not colder, exactly, but more precise. She was tall for her species, taller than Miri by nearly a foot, with blue-green skin a shade deeper than the child's and silver-threaded dark hair drawn back from a face so composed it seemed carved from patience and command. Her coat was long, charcoal with pale metallic seams at the collar and cuffs, severe enough to make Noah's cluttered hallway look like part of a completely different planet. When she reached the open doorway, her eyes settled first on Miri, and whatever steel lived in her expression shifted almost invisibly. Then she looked at Noah, at the sink, the empty bread sack, the chair with the short leg, the damp jacket, and finally at him again. "I am Captain Alira Voss," she said, her voice low and even and carrying through the apartment as if it had every right to do so. "And my daughter tells me that tonight, in a city full of people, you were the only one who was kind." Noah had been called worse things than kind, and by people with far less authority than the woman standing in his doorway, but something in the way Captain Alira Voss said it made the word feel heavier than praise. It felt like a judgment. Not of him alone, but of the whole room, the whole building, maybe even the whole city outside with its rain-slick alleys and shuttered windows. He straightened without meaning to, suddenly aware of the scuffed floor beneath his bare feet and the damp chill still trapped in his shirt. She was hungry, he said, because it was the simplest truth available and the only one he trusted not to sound foolish. Alira's gaze did not leave his face. Her eyes were a striking pale gold, clear and steady, and there was nothing careless in them. She looked like someone accustomed to being obeyed before she finished speaking. "Yes," she said. She was. The quietness of it carried more weight than anger would have. Miri moved then, just enough to step closer to her mother's side, though not behind her. Alira rested one hand lightly against the child's shoulder without looking down, a practiced gesture, protective but restrained, the kind that said affection had learned to coexist with responsibility a long time ago. Noah noticed the slight stiffness in her fingers before they settled. Fear had not belonged only to the child tonight. Markham cleared his throat softly and glanced toward the hallway, where the rumor of neighbors still lingered beyond the door like heat after lightning. "Captain," he said, "the matter of the token remains unresolved." Alira gave the tiniest nod. Not impatience. Permission. Her attention returned to Noah. "My daughter tells me she entrusted you with something," she said. No accusation. No softness either. Just precision. Noah felt the medallion against his chest again, warm now from his skin. For a second he considered all the practical reasons to hand it over immediately. End the questions. End the tension. End the feeling that the walls of his apartment had become thin enough for politics to pass through. But practicality was not the same as honor, and something about Miri's face kept him from pretending the two were interchangeable. He looked at the child instead. "Did you want me to keep it," he asked her, "or did you want me to protect it until you came back?" Miri blinked as if the distinction itself surprised her. The officers remained motionless. Markham said nothing. Alira's expression shifted by less than an inch, but Noah caught it anyway. Interest. Real interest. Miri lowered her eyes for a moment, thinking in the solemn, careful way children did when adults had taught them their words mattered. "I wanted it to stay with someone kind," she said at last. "Just in case I had to be afraid again." The sentence seemed to alter the temperature of the room. Noah heard Mrs. Bell's door outside close very softly, as if even eavesdropping had suddenly begun to feel shameful. Alira drew a slow breath through her nose, and for the first time the perfect control in her face showed a hairline crack. Not weakness. Weariness. The kind earned by too many dangers arriving in polished uniforms and official language. Noah reached into his shirt pocket and took out the medallion. Under the sink lamp it flashed once, pale silver with the three-pointed star at its center, impossibly fine against the roughness of his hand. He did not give it to Markham or either of the officers. He stepped forward once and held it out to Miri. "Then I think it belongs with you now," he said. Miri looked up at him, then at the medallion, and only after a brief pause did she take it back. Her small fingers closed around it with a gentleness that somehow made the object seem more important than ever. Alira watched the exchange without interruption. When Miri slipped the chain back beneath her cloak, the captain's eyes returned to Noah, but something in them had changed. The caution was still there. So was the authority. But now there was something else beneath both, quieter and far more dangerous to a guarded person than suspicion ever was. Respect. "Mr. Carter," Alira said, "what do you want in return for what you did tonight?" The question settled over the room with a weight that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the fact that, for the first time in Noah Carter's life, someone powerful was asking him what he wanted as if the answer might actually matter. He looked at Captain Alira Voss, at the polished restraint in her face, at the officers standing like carved pillars behind her, at Markham holding his tablet still for once, and then beyond them all to the shape of the hallway where the building listened through cheap doors and thin walls. He could almost feel Dockside breathing there in the dark. Mrs. Bell with her arthritic hands and suspicious eye. The young couple on the second floor whose heater failed every other week. The widower across the alley who sold scrap wire and pretended not to cough in winter. And Rourke too, because fairness was annoying that way, reaching even for men who did not deserve to be carried by it. Noah glanced at the empty bread sack on his counter and then back at Miri, who held her medallion now beneath her cloak as though its weight had changed. "You asked what I want," he said slowly. His voice sounded rougher than he intended, worn thin by hunger and the long night, but steady. "Then do not make this building pay for being afraid." Silence followed. Not cold silence. Listening silence. Noah went on before caution could tell him he had said enough. "People here hide when official vehicles stop outside because most of the time nothing good comes out of them. They keep their heads down because that is how they get through the week. Some of them make bad choices. Some of them make selfish ones. But fear and poverty are old roommates in Dockside. They teach ugly habits." His eyes flicked once toward the hallway, where Rourke's invisible presence seemed to linger like stale breath. "That does not make everyone here cruel." Miri was watching him with that same grave attention she had worn in the alley, only now the fear in her face had made room for something warmer and far more difficult to bear. Understanding. Alira did not interrupt. She stood perfectly still, but no one noticed the hand at her side had curled very slightly against the seam of her coat. "I do not want credits," Noah said. "I do not want a reward. I do not want anybody dragged out of their apartment tonight to make an example." He looked around his own room then, the chair with the short leg, the sink that smelled faintly of rust, the rain-traced window, and let out a breath that felt like it had been waiting in his chest for years. "If you want to do something useful. This district needs heat that works, clean water that does not taste like old pipes, and food people do not have to count bite by bite. Give them that. Give them one night where help knocks on the door instead of trouble." Markham lowered his tablet completely. One of the officers turned his helmet a fraction toward Alira, as if even through all that training and protocol something in the request had slipped past procedure and landed somewhere more personal. Miri's fingers tightened beneath her cloak. Alira's gaze stayed on Noah, pale gold and unreadable for such a long moment that he wondered if he had overstepped after all, if hunger and exhaustion had made him forget the difference between dignity and insolence. Then the captain looked away from him for the first time since entering the apartment and let her eyes travel over the room with a new kind of precision. Not the assessment of a commander entering an unknown space. The seeing of a witness who had finally stopped looking for threat long enough to notice need. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but every syllable carried. "You had the chance to ask for comfort for yourself," she said. Noah gave a small shrug. "I have had practice doing without." Something passed through Alira's expression then, swift and subtle and unmistakably human despite her alien features. Not pity. Something far more respectful than that. She turned to Markham. "Lift the residential hold on this block," she said. Then to the officers, in her own language first and then in English, so that Noah could understand every word. "Send for relief units from the diplomatic convoy. Portable heaters. Water cartridges. Shelf-stable rations. Medical scanners for every floor. Before dawn." The apartment went so still that Noah could hear the rain again, soft against the window, and beneath it the quiet, astonished sound of Miri smiling. For a moment nobody moved, as if the order itself had to travel through layers of disbelief before it could become real. Then the apartment came alive in quiet, efficient ways. Markham straightened and touched 2 fingers to the edge of his tablet, sending commands with quick, practiced motions that filled the dim room with soft blue light. One of the armored officers stepped into the hallway and began issuing instructions in that flowing language, his voice low but carrying, and almost immediately the mood outside shifted. The curious hush in the corridor broke apart into hurried footsteps, door latches, startled voices, the sound of people trying to decide whether hope was safer than caution. Noah stood near the sink with his hands hanging uselessly at his sides, feeling strangely more off balance now than when soldiers had first knocked on his door. It was easier, he realized, to brace for trouble than for mercy. Miri slipped out from beside her mother and crossed the room until she stood a few feet from him, close enough for Noah to see that someone had fastened her cloak in a hurry, one silver clasp set slightly crooked. She followed his gaze, touched the clasp, and then gave a small, solemn nod as if acknowledging the flaw with formal dignity. It nearly made him smile. "You were hungry too," she said. The words were so direct, so unguarded, that the room seemed to soften around them. Noah glanced at the paper bread sack on the counter. There was no point pretending otherwise. "Yes," he admitted. Miri frowned in a thoughtful way children did when fairness was being measured and found inadequate. She reached beneath her cloak, drew out the medallion once more, and held it against her chest for a brief second, not as a shield now but like a promise remembered. Then she looked up at him. "My tutors say that debt is a burden," she said. "But my grandmother says gratitude is a bridge." Noah was not prepared for that, for the careful seriousness in her voice or for the fact that somewhere in all the polished machinery of diplomacy there had apparently been one older woman wise enough to teach a child the difference between owing and honoring. "Your grandmother sounds smarter than most officials," he said. Markham, still working at his tablet, made a sound suspiciously close to a laugh. Alira heard it too but did not comment. She had moved nearer the window and stood watching the rain-silvered street below, where white lights now turned the puddles into broken mirrors. Within minutes, vehicles began arriving one after another, not loud, not theatrical, just deliberate. Compact relief carriers with diplomatic markings glided into the lot beside the building. Their side panels opened with hydraulic sighs. Workers in dark weather gear stepped out carrying heater units, water canisters, sealed food crates, and fold-out medical stations no bigger than kitchen tables. Dockside residents appeared at windows first, faces pale behind warped glass. Then they began emerging into hallways and stairwells, hesitant at first, clutching robes, blankets, sleeping children, old suspicions. Mrs. Bell came into the corridor with her cane in one hand and her chin lifted like she dared the universe to explain itself. Even Rourke reappeared at the far end, all his sly confidence gone now, standing in the bad hallway light with his hands hanging empty and his expression caught somewhere between shame and confusion. Alira turned from the window and found him there. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Fear is understandable, she said, and the corridor beyond the open door went still enough for every listening neighbor to hear. Cruelty is a choice. Learn the difference. Rourke dropped his gaze so fast it seemed physical. Noah looked away, not out of mercy for the man, but because tonight had already given enough weight to other people's failures. Miri took another small step toward him and, after the briefest hesitation, reached for his hand. Her fingers were warmer now. Will they really help everyone? She asked. Noah looked past her to the corridor, where a young mother on the second floor was already taking a water cartridge from a relief worker with both hands and an expression that did not know whether to thank or cry. He looked to the parking lot, where portable heaters were being wheeled under the awnings. He looked back at Miri, at Alira, at the rain still falling over dockside as if the night itself had not yet decided what kind of story this was. Yes, he said softly. I think this time they will. By the time dawn began to lift the darkness off dockside, the rain had thinned to a silver mist that hung between the buildings and caught the new lights in a soft, improbable glow. Noah stood just inside his window with one hand wrapped around a cup of hot broth a relief worker had pressed on him an hour earlier, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, the room smelled like warmth instead of rust. Outside, the lot below looked less like the back end of a forgotten district and more like the beginning of something gentle. Portable heaters hummed beneath awnings. Water canisters gleamed in neat rows. People who usually passed one another with tired eyes and shut mouths now stood in small knots speaking quietly over steaming cups, as if kindness had moved into the building overnight and everyone was still afraid to scare it away. Mrs. Bell sat on a folding stool in a blanket someone had draped over her shoulders, holding court with two relief workers half her age. The young mother from the second floor rocked her sleeping son beside a heater unit that cast a steady amber light over his face. Even the widower across the alley stood with both hands wrapped around a ration pack, staring at it like he was trying to remember whether gratitude was something you said aloud or just carried carefully. Noah took a slow sip of broth and felt the heat travel all the way down into the hollow place the bread had left behind. It almost hurt, that first real warmth. Behind him, the apartment door stood open. Not wide, just enough. The kind of opening that would have felt reckless yesterday and somehow felt right this morning. Miri sat on the chair with the short leg, her cloak gathered around her knees, watching the corridor with bright, serious eyes while Alira stood beside the sink speaking softly with Markham over the last details of departure. In daylight the captain seemed no less composed, but something in her had eased. The steel was still there. So was the distance worn by people who had spent too many years being useful before they were allowed to be human. Yet now, in Noah's cheap little kitchen, with steam rising from paper cups and morning turning the window pale gold, she looked less like an impossible figure from another world and more like a mother who had nearly lost something she could not bear to name. Miri slid off the chair and crossed the room, stopping beside Noah at the window. For a few seconds neither of them said anything. They just watched dockside wake under borrowed heat and unexpected mercy. Then Miri reached into the pocket of her cloak and drew out a sealed bread roll from one of the relief packs. It was still warm. Noah could see the faint curl of steam escape when she broke it open with both hands. She looked at the two halves for a moment, solemn as a priestess over some sacred little ritual, then held one piece out to him. Noah looked down at it, then at her. You should keep it, he said. Miri shook her head once. That is not how bridges work. The answer was so simple, so certain, that Noah felt a laugh rise in his chest before he could stop it. Not a big laugh. Just a quiet one, rough with sleep and hunger and relief. He took the bread. Their fingers brushed, warm this time. Behind them, Alira fell silent mid-sentence and turned just enough to see. Noah did not look back, but he felt the moment land all the same, light as dust and heavy as history. Outside, the first clean band of morning opened above the harbor, pale gold spilling across wet rooftops and old metal and relief tents and tired faces lifted toward the day. Noah stood there barefoot on the scuffed floor of Unit 6B, sharing bread with a child who had once been afraid in his arm's-length world, while an entire district breathed in warmth where only cold had lived the night before. He had not saved the city. He had not changed the stars. He had only stopped in an alley because somebody